The growth of American industry raised the standard of living for most people. However, growth also created sharper economic and class divisions among the rich, the middle class, and the poor. We are going to look at the impact of industrialization on the American worker. By the 1890s, the richest 10% of the US population controlled 90% of the nation's wealth. While the middle class was expanding due to an increase in education and middle management jobs created naturally through industrialization, the working class was still the largest group to make up the social hierarchy. Wages were so low, many wage workers were unable to support their families, forcing women and children to contribute to the household income. By 1900, 18% of all American workers were under the age of 16. That equates to approximately 13 million Americans. The late 19th century witnessed the most deadly and frequent labor conflicts in the nation's history. Many feared the country was headed towards open warfare between capital and labor. With a surplus of cheap labor, management held most of the power in its struggles with organized labor. Strikers could easily be replaced by bringing in strike breakers, or scabs, who were unemployed persons desperate for jobs. Employers also used all of the following tactics for defeating unions. 1. The lockout, which was seen by closing the factory to break a labor movement before it could get organized. Secondly, a blacklist, which was a name of pro-union workers circulated amongst all other employers. Yellow dog contracts, which were when workers were told as a condition for employment that they must sign an agreement not to join a union. Also calling in private guards and state militias to put down any strikes, and obtaining court injunctions against strikers. Moreover, management fostered public fear of unions as anarchistic and un-American. Before 1900, management won most of its battles with organized labor because if violence developed, employers could almost always count on the support of the federal and state governments. Labor itself was often divided on the best methods for fighting management. Some union leaders advocated political action. Others favored direct confrontation, strikes, picketing, boycotts, and slowdowns to achieve union recognition and collective bargaining. One of the worst outbreaks of labor violence in the century erupted in 1877 during an economic depression when the railroad companies cut wages in order to reduce costs. A strike on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad quickly spread across 11 states and shut down 2/3 of the country's rail trackage. Railroad workers were joined by 500,000 workers from other industries in an escalating strike that quickly became national in scale. For the first time since the 1830s, a president, who at the time was Rutherford B. Hayes, used federal troops to end labor violence. The strike and the violence finally ended, but not before more than 100 people had been killed. After the strike, some employers addressed the workers' grievances by improving wages and working conditions, while others took a hard line by busting workers' organizations. Before the 1860s, unions had been organized as local associations in one city or region. They usually focused on one craft or type of work. The first attempt to organize all workers in all states, both skilled and unskilled, both agricultural workers and industrial workers, was the National Labor Union. Founded in 1866, it had some 640,000 members by 1868. Besides reaching the goals of higher wages and the 8-hour workday, the first national union also had a broad social program. It wanted equal rights for women and blacks, monetary reform, and worker cooperatives. Its chief victory was winning the 8-hour workday for workers employed by the federal government. It lost support, however, over a depression beginning in 1873 and after the unsuccessful strikes of 1877. A second national labor union, the Knights of Labor, began in 1869 as a secret society in order to avoid detection by employers. Under the leadership of Terence V. Powderly, the union went public in 1881, opening its membership to all workers, including African Americans and women. Powderly advocated a variety of reforms, one of which is worker cooperatives to make each man his own employer. Second one, abolition of child labor, and thirdly, abolition of trusts and monopolies. He favored settling labor disputes by means of arbitration rather than resorting to strikes. Because the Knights were loosely organized, however, he could not control local units that decided to strike. The Knights of Labor grew rapidly and attained a peak membership of 730,000 workers in 1886. It declined just as rapidly, however, after the violence of the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886 turned public opinion against the Union. Chicago, with about 80,000 Knights in 1886, was the site of the first May Day labor movement. Also living in Chicago were about 200 anarchists who advocated the violent overthrow of all government. In response to the May Day movement calling for a general strike to achieve an 8-hour day, labor violence broke out at Chicago's McCormick Harvester plant. On May 4th, workers held a public meeting in Haymarket Square, and as police attempted to break up the meeting, someone threw a bomb, which killed 7 police officers. The bomb thrower was never found. Even so, 8 anarchist leaders were tried for the crime and 7 were sentenced to death. Horrified by the bomb incident, many Americans concluded that the Union movement was radical and violent. The Knights of Labor, as the most visible union at the time, lost popularity and membership. Unlike the reform-minded Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor concentrated on attaining restricted economic goals. Founded in 1886 as an association of 25 craft unions and led by Samuel Gompers until 1924, the AFL focused on just higher wages and improved working conditions. Gompers directed his local unions of skilled workers to walk out until the employer agreed to negotiate a new contract through collective bargaining. By 1901, the AFL was by far the nation's largest union with 1 million members. Even the union, however, would not achieve major successes until the early decades of the 20th century. 2 massive strikes in the last decade of the 19th century demonstrated both the growing discontent of labor and the continued power of management to prevail in industrial disputes. The first is the Homestead Strike. Henry Clay Frick, the manager of Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Plant near Pittsburgh, precipitated a strike in 1892 by cutting wages by nearly 20%. Frick used the weapons of the lockout, private guards, and strikebreakers to defeat the steelworkers' walkout after 5 months. The failure of the Homestead Strike set back the union movement in the steel industry until the New Deal in the 1930s. The second strike would be the Pullman Strike. Even more alarming to conservatives was a strike of workers living in George Pullman's company town near Chicago. Pullman manufactured the famous railroad sleeping cars known as Pullman cars. In 1894, he announced a general cut in wages and fired the leaders of the workers' delegation who came to bargain with him. The workers at Pullman laid down their tools and appealed for help from the American Railroad Union, whose leader, Eugene V. Debs, directed railroad workers not to handle any trains with Pullman cars. The union's boycott tied up rail transportation across the country. Railroad owners supported Pullman by linking Pullman cars to mail trains. They then appealed to President Cleveland, persuading him to use the Army to keep the mail trains running. A federal court issued an injunction forbidding interference with the operation of the mail and ordering railroad workers to abandon the boycott and the strike. For failing to respond to this injunction, Debs and other union leaders were arrested and jailed. The jailing of Debs and others effectively ended the strike. The Supreme Court approved the use of court injunctions against strikes, which gave employers a very powerful weapon to break unions. After serving a 6-month jail sentence, Debs concluded that more radical solutions were needed to cure labor's problems. He turned to socialism and the American Socialist Party, which he helped to found in 1900. By 1900, only 3% of American workers belonged to unions. Management held the upper hand in labor disputes, with government generally taking its side. However, people were beginning to recognize the need for a better balance between the demands of employers and employees to avoid the numerous strikes and violence that characterized the late 19th century. Watch this film clip on the labor movement and child labor.
To most of us, Labor Day means time off from work, maybe a barbecue to mark the official end of summer. But how much do you know about what inspired its creation? The labor movement. The labor movement started around the Industrial Revolution, a time in the late 19th century when America exploded in size and wealth. Advances in technology created manufacturing jobs, and people moved to cities to work in factories. But it wasn't the workers getting rich. It was their bosses who raked in big profits by paying low wages for long hours. Fed up with big business, industrial workers created unions to fight for better conditions. Unions are the backbone of the labor movement, but what exactly did they accomplish? Well, for one, you can thank the labor movement for your work-free weekend. In the late 1800s, the average American worked as much as 100 hours a week. Unions held strikes to demand shorter work weeks and an 8-hour workday to make time for family and relaxation. The most famous strike, the Haymarket Riots, happened in Chicago on May 1st, 1886, with thousands of people taking to the streets, and their voices only grew louder from there. The labor movement also protested child labor. Remember those black and white photos of children with dirty, sad faces wearing overalls and beanie caps? Those kids weren't playing outside, but they were working in factories. In 1881, unions demanded that businesses stop hiring kids under 14. And slowly but surely, measures against child labor caught on around the country. Eventually, all those protests got results. In 1938, Congress passed a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the 40-hour work week, regulated child labor, and set standards for minimum wage and overtime pay. In the 1930s and 1940s, workers were also able to negotiate health benefit plans from their employers. Though union membership is on a decline today, it's undeniable that the labor movement forever changed the way Americans live, work, and even relax.
Okay, now for the essential question. Analyze the impact of the labor movement in America throughout the 19th century and determine why did the movement fail in the late 1800s and later triumph in the early 1900s.